Hey guys, in this video we're going to do something really cool. We are going to create a default attack animation for this attack state, and then we're going to swap it out programmatically at runtime. It's going to magically get swapped from the default attack using something called an Animator override controller to whatever attack is associated with the weapon that's in the player's hand. Like the hoe has this attack associated. So it's going to dynamically swap that at runtime using something called an Animator override controller. So I will see you in there. Welcome back, fine people. I have found me a bug in my game. Let me just show you if I can reproduce it. It's basically, oh, that was quick, that was lucky. It's a projectile related bug. And if we look at it, it's saying the object of type game object, well, this is on a projectile, has been destroyed, has been destroyed, but you're trying to access it. Your script should either check if it's null or you should not destroy the object. So if I click that error and go into projectile.cs in the onCollisionEnter method, you'll see that at this point we are asking the question, if the layer collided with is not equal to the shooter layer, then we should deal damage. So basically don't deal damage to things that we are on the same layer as. Fine, but how about if shooter is blank for some reason? I'm not going to get into why because it's not the subject of this video, but it's possible that shooter is blank. One way to protect this is like this. If shooter and. Now, why does that work? It's a good question if you're saying, well, why is that safe? How do we, how come this thing isn't on the right, isn't being looked at if the shooter on the left is not true? Well, that's because of the way that C# deals with these types of things. And in your resources, I've given you a link to so-called short circuit operators in C#. I'm actually giving you a link to a Google search so you can read about it yourself. But that's a good search to do and you can read all about it. Basically, C# will not bother evaluating the right-hand side of this statement if the left-hand side is false, because it can't possibly, the and cannot be true. The logical and cannot be true if this is false on the left, right? So enough of that. That will fix that bug and get rid of it. Let's move on. Back in our project, let's talk about what an Animator override controller actually is. Well, let's just remember what our player is trying to do. We want to be able to give Rick the facility to put a different animation on every player. On every weapon. Now remember that the player is holding a weapon. In this case, he's holding a hoe. If we go look at the definition of the hoe, it may or may not have an attack animation associated with it. So we've got this RPG character animation pack. By the way, we've just got to deal with the creator of this pack. We are going to provide you the entire pack for free shortly in the course. But anyway, which is good news, of course, but you're not going to be allowed to use it for commercial purposes. Anyway, we have the hoe, and in the hoe we choose an animation of some sort. And what we want to do is we want to pass that through to the player at runtime. So we may be doing an unarmed attack left 3. But at the moment, that's not doing anything, because if you look at runtime at the animator for the player, if we click on the player and have a look at the animation, you'll see that he's by default got this unarmed attack kick left 1. What we need to do is swap out the attack at runtime, basically. So what an Animator override controller does is it says, I'm going to swap out a given motion clip from your animator, in this case, this default we have in here, this unarmed attack kick L1. I'm going to swap that out with whatever you tell me to swap it out with. So first thing I'm going to do with this is just have a default attack animation state for characters. So I'm going to go into characters. I'm going to make myself a new animation. So create animation, which is an animation clip. And I'm just going to call it default attack, I think. Okay, a default attack animation light. It's going to do nothing. It's going to be very boring. If we were to drag the player into the preview window, it's actually going to cause him to do something funny, which is fine. We're going to make our code so that he always has a sensible default animation. Or, if you want, you can come in and put the default attack to something safer, like a punch. But I'm just going to leave it like this, because I ultimately never want him to use the default animation. Why am I making a default animation? Because I want to set the attack state in the Animator controller to this default attack animation. Why do I want to do that? Because at runtime, I want to swap out something that I can easily find, namely default attack. I want to swap that out for the animation that I actually want that's specified by the weapon. That makes me think I should probably call it something a bit more obvious that we shouldn't rename. This is effectively a constant because we're later going to need to find this thing in code. So I'm going to call that default attack in bold like that to remind me that I shouldn't be renaming it. Okay, we'll also put some protection around that in a bit. But Step 1, we have a default attack animation. Now, step 2, how do we switch this thing out at runtime, and why would that be useful? Well, it's useful because we don't know until runtime which animation we're going to use, and we could have a whole bunch of animation states in here, but that gets really confusing. I want just a very simple and easy to reason about Animator controller, unlike the one that comes with the RPG pack. I don't know if they provide one in this free pack. I think they don't. No, they do. Here you go. And does it have... Yeah, look at this. It's got a bunch of stuff in here. And then it's got all these funny attacks and stuff. And it gets far too complicated, okay? So I'm trying to avoid this and avoid attacks that are referenced by number and just have a simple, single animator controller for the player that is as simple as it can possibly be and swaps out the animations at runtime. So I'm going to have a default attack, swap it out at runtime. The way I'm going to do that is to create a animator override controller. So you right click in your, in this case in my player, because it's specific to the player, this one, for now, create animator override controller. So let's talk about how to override animations at runtime. I am going to rename this animator override controller player animator override, something like that. And what it does is once you select a given controller, in this case the third person animator controller. Now, yes, that's in the standard assets, and it probably ultimately shouldn't be. It should be in our characters folder. We'll sort that out shortly. And secondly, yeah, we want to give it a better name. But for now, let's just live with that stuff and just notice that we've got a very sore thumb sticking out here. It's a British expression for sticking out like a sore thumb is this default attack. And what you can actually do here offline, but you shouldn't, what you can do is come in and say, well, I'm going to substitute that for an unarmed backward roll in the default attack. Then what happens, I'll just show you it in operation, for example, is if we click on the player and look at his animation list under the animation tab of your Windows, you can see that at edit time like this, when we're not running, we have default attack as specified by the animator controller. If I then play the game and take a look in this list, look, it's swapped out. Well, it hasn't swapped out default attack. I was hoping the reason it hasn't is because we're not yet using this animator controller override. So just having it here, even though we've connected it to the third person animator controller and told it to swap default attack at runtime for something else, we're not yet using it. We have to use this thing in code. All right. So before I do that, I'm going to remove this swap out. Why? Because if this is just an exposed parameter, this swap out here, we're going to specify in code at runtime which animation clip to replace default attack with. If I choose one here now, it's going to override or supersede, to use a less confusing word, whatever I do in code. So don't put anything in these things on the actual asset of the player's animator override. Don't put anything in there. We want to do it all in code. All right. So how do we do it in code? Well, let's go take a little look. It's the player, firstly, that we need to give access to an animator override controller. So I'm going to serialize field on the player. I'm going to hope that we have access to animator override controller, long word, thank you for the help. And I'm just going to call it what it is, an animator override controller. In fact, it's a long word, so I'm just going to paste it, and then I'm going to go back to the beginning and change it to a small a for our variable convention. Okay, cool. So that's it. We've exposed an animator override controller on the player. Then I go back to the player as a prefab, and I tell the prefab that on my player script that I want a player animator override. Good. So that first step has wired up the player animator override, and we have programmatic access to it here in our code. All right, so next up, we want to write a hopeful method. The hopeful method is that we override animator controller. My fingers know what I'm doing better than I do. So we wished we had a method called override animator controller, and then we go ahead and we generate the method. Now it's going to throw a not implemented exception until we go ahead and implement it. So this is in the start of the player. We register for mouth kicks, set our max health points, which actually, you know what? Even though it's a silly, tiny method, that should be a method because these should all be methods. We don't want to jump from methods to single statements. It's an inconsistent level of abstraction. So I'm just going to say set current max health. Then the start reads really beautifully. It's a set of simple English instructions, all right? So how do we override the animator controller? Well, the first thing is we better go and find the animator. So let's go and get our animator controller equals get, just controller, equals get component of type animator. Now this is happening in start, so we don't mind getting component just the once here. So we've got our animator now, or our animator controller. Let's just call it animator. Actually, it's simpler. Now, we need a type, of course. So var, what's that coming out as an animator? Good. Then we say to the animator, there's a property on it called runtime animator controller. We're saying, okay, Mr. Animator, we want your runtime animator controller to be this puppy up here, the animator override controller. I think that reads very nicely. It's pretty clear what it's doing. Finding the animator, overriding its runtime controller. So the final thing we need to do here is using this animator override controller. Yeah, if I can type straight. Come on, Ben. It's pretty late. Using the animator override controller, what you can do is you have on it a ability with square brackets to access animation clips. Now you have to access them by a string name, which isn't very nice. And the string name we need is whatever we decided to choose here in bold, which is the default attack anim. But we only ever have to put this in once. So I'm going to copy that, paste it in as a string. Now we'll put it as a parameter in a moment. I just want to explain what I'm doing. We're saying, hey, animator override controller, I want you to substitute the default attack, which is the same thing as you see if I go and look in here. It's say, find this thing in the list, the default attack, and swap out to a new animation clip. Well, what animation clip do we use? We use the weapon in use dot get weapon. Actually, we need a method. We haven't got it. So we're going to go to the weapon in use and give ourselves a method that is going to give us the ability to get the animation that we need. So you might be tempted to just make this animation clip public so that you can get that, but don't, because we're going to want to add some value to this. So we want a public animation clip and get anim clip for weapon. No, it's weapon.getAnimClip, that's fine. And we are going to, later we may add some value to this getter, but for now we're just simply going to return attack animation. So get anim clip, get attack anim clip. Yeah, that's a better name. Get attack anim clip is the public method we are sticking on the weapons. Back to the player for a moment. So it's weapon in use dot get attack anim clip. Wicked. Okay, so the final thing I want to do, actually, let's just test this. So I'll make myself a to-do remove parameter, this constant here, this constant. But I don't want to do that now. I just want to test this works. I want to test that we are overriding the animator controller with these simple steps. So let's go into Unity. Let's go to play the game. Now let's inspect the player, look at the animation tab, scroll down and notice that we have unarmored attack 3, which is the animation clip for the hoe. If we stop playing the game, in the list we have default attack. So that is actually working. And the way to corroborate that is to give the player a different weapon in his hand, like the rod. Now notice that the rod's definition actually doesn't have an animation clip at the moment, so let's give it one. Let's just call it unarmed attack. Oh, I don't know, just something really noticeable. Death 1, it's the wrong type of attack. We'll remember Death 1. Back to the animation list of the player, default attack until you play. And then when you play, look in the list, we have Death 1. Awesome. And we may or may not see this reflected in the animator override controller. You do at runtime. So another way to see this in action is just to look at the player animator override controller, stop the game, and actually it's remembered that Death 1. But we don't care about that, because if we were to switch the player back to another weapon, like the hoe, and then go watch it, still Death 1, when we play the game, should switch back to whatever the hoe uses, which is attack L3. Awesome. So now we actually have this swapping out. We're never calling that animation. We can do that in another video. This one's got quite long, but if we were to click anim there, we get an attack, and we also get a problem, which is the hit event has no receiver. So there's an issue that we are going to have to deal with in the next video. But for this one is done, your challenge is to make sure you've caught up with everything I've just done. I've done a whole bunch of stuff. It's quite important you catch up with it. To help you with that, I'm just going to quickly go back in the source control and just to give you a quick recap of what we've changed. So nothing under there. Characters, nothing significant there. I'm just looking for script changes for you. Player.cs has had the following changes on my screen. And remember, you can always go to our GitHub link in the lecture resources to see these changes as well. But this is what I've done, all the green lines of what I've added, and that's really the bulk of it. Remember that we also, on the weapon, provided the facility to get the attack animation clip. So I hope you found that useful, really useful new facility, and I'll see you in the next video.